In this video, we are going to talk about the uh, case crossover study, which is the fourth variety of the case control, as we have discussed in previous videos, the three other types. And it is an observation analog to a crossover study, and this means that it has similarity in the design or the methodology of the randomized crossover clinical control trial. And the case crossover design, the study method used to evaluate the effect of a transient exposure to an acute event like, for example, myocardial infarction or heart attack or acute severe asthma attack or whatsoever. This design is particularly useful in scenarios where the exposure is temporary and limited and the outcome is immediate following the exposure. It is particularly useful when the exposure is short duration and the effect on the outcome is immediate and transient, as we have mentioned, like the situations of cases of clinical cases of myocardial infarction or ischemic heart disease or acute attack of asthma. As we can see in this slide, the case crossover design as proposed by Mockler in 1991 to study the transient effects on the risk of acute cardiac events. And maybe more explanation here is that we can look for two periods. We have the control period, which is before the risk period, before the exposure period, and then we make comparison between the control period and the case period in order to find if ever that exposure had resulted in the event. The key features of the crossover design is that each subject serves as their own control, comparing their exposure status during the case period, as we have mentioned, or the other period just before the event, and one, two, or more control periods, times when the event did not occur. Meaning that you have to compare between two periods, the period that before the occurrence of the event and other period where the event did not occur, so that we can find. And this will help control for confounding factors that are constant within an individual, such as genetics or baseline health problems. Case or hazard period and control periods. The case period is the time window immediately before the acute event when the exposure impact is evaluated, and the control periods over time windows in the same individual used for comparison with the case period. Transient exposures and outcome. The design is best suited for studying transient exposures to maybe, for example, physical exercise or great efforts that you have done immediately before the occurrence of, for example, myocardial infarction, and such as air pollution also, or medication use, or any sort of stresses, whether psychological stresses or physical stresses, and their effects on sudden events or sudden outcomes, as we have mentioned. Elimination of between subject confounding by comparing different time periods in the same person, and the design remove confounding factors, as we have mentioned, such as age, sex, lifestyle, and other factors. And the case crossover study design proposed by Mockler 1991 is suited to the study of a transient effect of an intermittent exposure on the subsequent risk of a rare acute onset of disease that is assumed to occur short time after the exposure. The principle of Mockler's case crossover design is that the exposures of cases just prior to the event are compared using matched case control approaches to the distribution of the exposure estimated from data for the case from some separate time periods for comparison. And each case act, as we have mentioned, as its own control, and thus each study subject should have a case window and as well as control window. A risk exposure during the case window is compared to risk exposure during the control window. And it is a design which is so suitable for situations like myocardial infarction, and you try to find the exposure before the occurrence of myocardial infarction or acute attack of bronchial asthma, for example, if somebody has been exposed to any of the factors that can initiate that event. The advantages, as we have mentioned, is that it's efficient, self-matching, and efficient that we select only cases because the case will act also as a control for himself or herself, and can use multiple control windows for one case window, and useful for studying rare or acute outcomes due to transient exposures of as in examples which I have mentioned. This advantage is that usually such design is suffering from information bias, inaccurate recall of exposure during the control period, and it requires careful selection of the time period during which the control window occurs. Also, this design is suffering from recall bias. If the exposure information is self-reported, participants may not accurately recall their exposure during the hazard or during the risk period and the control period. While it requires careful selection of the length and timing of the windows so that you can make the comparison more accurate and more appropriate. Temporal trends, day of the week, for example, can introduce bias, and also the assumption that the control period represents typical exposure pattern is another disadvantages. And so by the end, we come to the end of discussing the 4 varieties of the case control designs, the classical one and the nested case control and the case cohort. And lastly, we discuss the case crossover control. Thank you very much.